Hello again. I'm Greg Smart, pastor of Pikeville United Methodist Church in Pikeville, Tennessee. And again, we're here during the end of the Christmas season with some thoughts on Scripture. And I'm recording this today on what is known as Epiphany Sunday. The day of Epiphany is actually this coming Wednesday, January 6th. And for those of you keeping track at home, that is the 12th day of Christmas. But our scripture for today is actually the traditional scripture for Epiphany, and it is one you know very well. It involves three wise men. As I said, you know that story. You know those wise men, those magi. You know the gifts they bring. We know it so well and like it so well that a really rich tradition has grown up around it. We have given names to each of the wise men. We've given them backstories, and we've decided that there were three wise men, even though the scripture never really says that. Well, we just assume that since there were three gifts, there must be three people. Well, despite the fact that we know this story well, there actually is another major player in this story. That person is Herod. Now, we usually don't talk too much about Herod with this story, and I'm not real sure why. It could be because he's the villain in it, and we know he doesn't win, so we ignore him, or maybe we just don't want to have villains at this time of year. Heat miser and cold miser seem to be all we can stand. But Herod is there, and as we read this scripture today, I would like you to really pay attention to Herod, because after we've read it, we are going to compare and contrast Herod with the wise men. That's your assignment, and this is our scripture. This is Matthew chapter 2, the first 12 verses. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet, 'And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel.' Then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, 'Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word, so that I may also go and pay him homage.' When they had heard the king, they set out, and there ahead of them went the star that they had seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then opening their treasure chest, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road." Well, that's our reading for this morning, and we're now ready to look at Herod versus the wise men, and we are going to start with how they reacted to that star. And why not? The star is the catalyst. It is what sets all these events in motion. It's why we put stars on the top of the Christmas tree, like the one you see behind me, or like in this handmade one we sometimes just hang on the tree. It's why we have those stars. Well, the wise men, they noticed that star, and they noticed that it was a new star, one that had not been there previously. So they were determined to follow this star, to understand it, and to find the child, the Messiah, that was under it. And while the wise men were busy with this determined search, guess who didn't even know there was a star? Now, I don't know if you did it or not, but in the days before Christmas, we, of course, had what was called the Bethlehem star. I believe that was when Jupiter and Saturn got so close together that it looked like one light. You may very well have gone out to see it. I have to confess that on the night when they were the closest together, which was December 21st, I was coming back from Chattanooga. I was heading down 111 into the Sequatchie Valley, and this was right after it had become full dark. And there is a overlook, or kind of a rest area overlook there on 111, so you can look down into the valley. It's gorgeous. And I looked over and it was full. I had never seen that many cars there. There was not a single parking place. And then, as I continued past it, I noticed that over on the same side of the highway as the overlook, there were cars parked all along the shoulder, all the way, at least halfway down the mountain, maybe more. There were even some cars parked on the shoulder on my side of the highway, and I was very concerned that some of them had tried to hop that concrete barrier in the middle to get over to the overlook in the middle of traffic. And as I was noticing all this, I was trying to figure out what was going on. My first thought was maybe it was some sort of rally or protest, but it was far too quiet for that. And then another possibility occurred that maybe this was a dedication. Maybe they were adding something to that overlook area and people had gathered for this auspicious occasion. By the time I got to the bottom of the mountain, I thought, well, maybe the city of Dunlap was shooting off fireworks for Christmas and those people wanted a good view. It wasn't until the next morning, and I mean late in the morning, where I finally went, oh, they were there to see the star. They went up on this mountain to get a good view over the plateau. And I realized then, too, that the people who had parked on the side of the road, and I assume they walked up to the overlook, those were people who really, really wanted to see that star, so much so that they were willing to put in that effort. As for me, I knew that that star was going to be there. I wanted to see it, but I completely forgot about it. And you know what? That's on me. Now, Herod didn't have that excuse. He didn't forget. He didn't even know the star was there. And this was despite the fact that that star was practically on top of him. Bethlehem is only about 5.5 miles from the center of Jerusalem. He clearly could have seen it, but Herod had no idea. Well, that's our first point of comparison. The second one had to do with who these men were, and maybe that explains why some knew about the star and some didn't. We'll start with Herod, who was a king. We're told flat out he is King Herod. And yet, his is a very geographically specific rule. He may be king, but that kingdom is tightly defined, which I suppose most kingdoms are, but in Herod's case, there was absolutely no chance that the boundaries of that kingdom would be expanded. That's because, though he was a king, Herod was actually a political appointee of Caesar. It was a title, a job he had been given. Now, he was still king for all intents and purposes, with wealth, the potential for wealth and income there, as well as all kinds of privileges. Now, it's good to be the king. But he was to rule that area, to be in charge, but he was under the authority of Rome, and he served at their discretion. Now, these wise men, we do call them kings on occasion. We three kings of Orient are. But there's no evidence that they were kings in any traditional sense of the word. I'm not even sure how we started calling them that. They don't rule any areas. They don't hold any authority, power like that. They don't have thrones. What they were magi. And that is a term that applied to the priesthood over in Persia, which was to the east. As magi, as these priests, they were trained in astronomy, which is why they were looking to the heavens, why they knew this star was brand new and what it portended. They were also what we most commonly call them. They were wise. And wisdom is marked by deep understanding, keen discernment, and sound judgment. In other words, everything that Herod is not. If it sounds like I'm being kind of hard on Herod, well, our next point of comparison will show pretty plainly what he's lacking. And that next point of comparison is motivation. What drives a person to travel who knows how many miles to find out what is under a star? For that matter, what would drive a person to do the math to figure out what point would be under that star? Well, we might say it was for the potential of gaining wealth, kind of like looking for the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. But that's not what was driving these wise men. They were not looking to gain wealth. Actually, they came and gave wealth away. For them, it was a matter of, well, they understood that this new star that had appeared was unprecedented. They discerned that this was a divine act. And so they came to pay tribute, to worship, and to give their loyalty. You know, when you believe that God is the cause of some effort behind it, well, the wise people, they want to be a part of that effort. They are willing to go where God is leading. Thus, we have the wise men there. As for Herod, when he finally found out that there was a star, well, he frantically gathered all the experts he could find to tell him what that star was about. He wanted to know if that star meant good things for Herod or bad. Well, it meant bad. According to the prophecy, that star meant that a child had been born, the Messiah. And that Messiah would be a threat to Herod's rule. Well, at this point, there really should be no more question about why Herod really wanted to find the child. It wasn't to pay him homage, it was to get rid of him. And if you are inclined to give Herod the benefit of the doubt there, just continue reading in Matthew's 2nd chapter. And you'll find that shortly after those wise men gave Herod the slip, he ordered the slaughter of all children 2 years old and under. Not just boys, all children. This is a man who was determined to keep his throne at any cost. Well, now that we've compared and contrasted Herod with the wise men, let's take a look at the whole picture of what we've come up with. You know, Herod, he was oblivious to that star, which made perfect sense. If it didn't enrich him or ensure his power. It just wasn't on his radar. We also see that he was desperate to maintain his power and willing to be ruthless in that effort. And his motivation was almost entirely about his own self-interests. Now, with the wise men, we find that they were open to the wonders of creation, that they could discern God's voice, God's presence, God's activity in events that were happening around them. They could see God where nobody else could. And their motivation was controlled by God's interests. Well, I suppose all that's interesting, but it leads to the big question. So what? What does any of this have to mean for us in the 21st century? Well, it's the beginning of a new year. The third day of that new year as I'm recording this. And that's traditionally been a good time to do some soul searching, some self-reflection. And the exercise we have done this morning actually gives us some direction for that inner work. And you can start by simply asking yourself, do you want to be like Herod, or would you rather be like the wise men? I want to give you some specifics on that. When you're faced with an issue, is it about you, or is it about God? Are you open to hearing God's voice? And really, when it comes to life, what is it that motivates you? Those are good questions to sit with and wrestle with. But it's also kind of hard to remember, so I'm going to boil it down, make that even more simple. And we'll start by noting that that Bethlehem star, both the recent one and the one over the baby Jesus, it's gone. But the light still shines. That's the light of Christ, the light of God's kingdom. And here come your questions. In regards to that light, do you see it? Do you follow it? And why? I hope you'll take those questions seriously and let them give your life new direction. Until then, I'm Greg Smart, wishing you a happy new year.